Welcome to True Crime Stories Doc. If you're fascinated by real-life mysteries, cold cases, and the dark corners of human behavior, you're in the right place. Here, we dive deep into the most gripping true crime cases, from shocking unsolved mysteries to chilling criminal investigations, all presented with care, accuracy, and respect for the victims. This is a story of serial rapists linked to 1980s-90s cases via DNA. A decades-old investigation connected former Navy diver Sean Patrick McNulty to 6 rapes from California, Michigan, and Ohio using genetic genealogy and modern DNA methods.
No reason to believe they were connected. Each investigation began in isolation. A local department scrambling to respond, to comfort, to collect, to pursue. Leads dried up. Suspects were questioned and released. The trail went cold, then frozen. But in the background, a revolution was brewing. One invisible to the detectives who had long since retired, and to the women who had spent years trying to heal. The revolution lived in blood, in saliva, in a microscopic code carried by every human being, DNA. In the early 2000s, DNA databases changed the way law enforcement solved crimes. But those systems only worked when the perpetrator's genetic profile was already in the system, when they had been caught for something else and entered into CODIS, the combined DNA index system. If someone had managed to live an otherwise quiet life, they stayed invisible. Sean Patrick McNulty was invisible. A former Navy diver, he had served with discipline and skill. His career took him from one coast to another, from underwater salvage operations to periods of civilian anonymity. He had no serious criminal record, no red flags that would land him in a federal DNA database. When he committed his crimes, he left behind physical evidence, but not his name. It wasn't until the emergence of genetic genealogy, a new field where forensic science intersected with publicly shared family tree data, that the invisible became traceable. Investigators could take a DNA profile from a crime scene, run it through open-source genealogy sites, and find distant relatives of the unknown suspect. From there, painstaking family tree research narrowed the field. And in 2025, a break came. A cold case team connected DNA from a series of brutal sexual assaults in the 1980s and 1990s to a single man, Sean Patrick McNulty. This wasn't just a name on paper. It was a seismic shift. 6 separate rapes, spread over years and miles, suddenly converged on one individual. For the survivors, some now in their 50s and 60s, the news was like breathing after decades underwater. Justice hadn't forgotten them. Science had simply been catching up. The story of how McNulty was identified isn't just about crime and punishment. It's about time, technology, and the unrelenting determination of investigators who refuse to let women's stories be reduced to case numbers. It's a story of trauma revisited, but also of hope restored. It's about a man who believed the world had moved on, and a world that finally caught up to him. And it begins, as many of these stories do, with a single night of violence that spiraled outward, leaving scars on strangers who would one day learn they were all connected by a single, hidden predator. The crime's 1980s, 1990s. When detectives finally pieced together the cases in 2025, what shocked them wasn't just who the suspect turned out to be, it was how carefully the crimes had been scattered. Like a predator who understood jurisdictional blind spots, Sean Patrick McNulty seemed to know when to strike and where, so that his acts of violence stayed hidden from one another. In total, 6 assaults would eventually be linked to him. They stretched across 3 states over more than a decade. Each case at the time stood alone, a horrifying night in one city, a cold file in another, no pattern anyone could see. Only the DNA.
Silent, waiting connected them. Case 1, Southern California, 1984. The first known assault took place in a suburban coastal town in Southern California in 1984. At the time, the area was growing quickly. Families moving in, Navy housing nearby, and a population large enough that violent crime sometimes went unnoticed in the churn of police calls. This early 20s was attacked while returning to her apartment late at night. The assault bore marks of premeditation. No forced entry, a weapon used to control, a methodical sequence that left little physical evidence beyond the biological sample that would, decades later, become the key. Police interviewed neighbors, friends, coworkers. The suspect's description was vague. A male, physically fit, commanding in tone, with no fingerprints, no witnesses, and no surveillance cameras in an era before digital recording. The case soon went cold. Case 2. San Diego region, 1986. 2 years later, a remarkably similar assault took place not far away, this time closer to a Navy installation. The victim, again in her 20s, was attacked in her own home after an apparent break-in. The assailant's knowledge of her routine suggested surveillance. He left abruptly, taking nothing but leaving terror in his wake that, at the time, San Diego police suspected military involvement. Something about the attacker's clipped instructions, his physical control, and his tactical patience pointed to training. But leads ran dry, and jurisdictional sensitivities often discouraged deep dives into active duty personnel. Without a suspect to test, the rape kit sat unprocessed for years, then processed but unmatched. Case 3, Detroit Metro, Michigan, 1989. By the end of the decade, the violence shifted hundreds of miles east. In suburban Detroit, another young woman reported being assaulted under circumstances that baffled investigators. The method, late-night ambush, controlled language, and exit that left no trace, echoed the California attacks, but Michigan detectives had no reason to compare notes with their West Coast counterparts. The crime lab extracted a DNA profile in the early 1990s, when forensic science began to reach new heights, but at that time, cross-state comparisons required specific requests or federal intervention. None came. Case 4, Cleveland, Ohio, 1990. Less than a year later, a similar attack occurred in Cleveland. Again, a young adult woman, again at night. Again, a predator who seemed to anticipate her vulnerability. The assault was brutal yet clinical. The survivor later told detectives she sensed the attacker had done this before, a chilling intuition later validated by science. Cleveland police, operating under their own caseload pressures, pursued local suspects. None panned out. Without a confession or matching fingerprints, the case froze. Case 5, Columbus, Ohio, 1992. In 1992, a college town became the backdrop for the fifth assault. Here, the survivor was a student walking back from a late library session. She was grabbed, threatened, and sexually assaulted in a secluded area. The attacker seemed unafraid of being caught, confident, almost rehearsed. He vanished into the night. The DNA profile was saved, entered into early local databases, and checked against every major Cody's update in subsequent years. Every time, the result came back the same: no match. Case 6, Toledo, Ohio, 1994. The sixth known attack took place in Toledo, rounding out a geographic pattern that, viewed in hindsight, mirrored McNulty's life trajectory. Navy service, relocations, and eventual civilian moves that kept him just ahead of local suspicion. The details aligned. Age range of victim, methodical control, evidence of planning, and a disappearance into darkness to be why the mid-1990s, the nation's criminal justice system was drowning in unprocessed rape kits. Each jurisdiction fought for resources.
Some built lives shadowed by trauma, but sustained by resilience. Others kept quiet, fearing disbelief, stigma, or re-traumatization through legal processes that rarely favored survivors in that era. What none of them could have imagined was that one day, scientists would be able to read the invisible threads between their assaults. Threads left in biological code, preserved in sterile envelopes, waiting for a generation of investigators unwilling to let the past remain unsolved. In the mid-1980s, sexual assault investigations followed a script that today feels outdated but, at the time, was standard procedure. When a survivor reported an attack, uniformed officers arrived first. They secured the scene if there was one to secure. They asked questions, sometimes too many, too soon, with too little sensitivity, then called in detectives. A sexual assault exam was performed at a hospital. Evidence, hair, fibers, swabs, went into labeled envelopes. Those envelopes went into evidence lockers. From there, the process slowed. Testing biological evidence was expensive and, in many jurisdictions, a logistical nightmare. Labs were overrun with homicide evidence. Sexual assault kits joined long queues. Some were tested years later. Others, in some places, never were. It wasn't indifference. It was a system stretched beyond capacity. In Los Angeles, for example, tens of thousands of kits sat untested for years. Detroit had similar backlogs. Smaller cities had even fewer resources. Some local police departments relied on state labs. Some sent work to private labs if they had budget room. Many had none. The first and second assaults took place in Southern California, in neighboring jurisdictions, but separate police departments. The detectives who worked them did not routinely meet to compare cases. There was no unified database of MO, modus operandi, traits. A rape in one suburb looked like a tragic, singular crime to the officers handling it. Another rape, 50 miles away, might look similar on paper, but without a mechanism to connect them. The pattern remained hidden. When McNulty moved east, the disconnect grew wider. Michigan and Ohio investigators had no immediate reason to look toward California for leads. In fact, cross-state data sharing was primitive. The FBI maintained some centralized criminal information, but without a name or fingerprints, local police had nothing to enter. By the early 1990s, DNA was changing everything, in theory. Labs could extract a genetic profile from biological material left at a crime scene. But the combined DNA index system, CODIS, was still young. Profiles went in if the perpetrator was convicted of certain crimes. No conviction, no profile. The database wasn't a net dragging through the population. It was a filing cabinet for known criminals. McNulty had no convictions of record that triggered a DNA sample. So even if a lab processed every one of those rape kits, they would have matched only to each other, not to a name. And that matching case-to-case hits was rare. Detectives had to ask for it. A lab analyst would run a search across the state's stored profiles, sometimes across neighboring states, rarely across the country. It was a manual process layered on an emerging technology. Errors were common. Misconnections were inevitable. Each case had its own set of leads. Ex-boyfriends, co-workers, strangers in the neighborhood, maybe a suspicious car spotted nearby. Detectives followed them until they hit walls. They wrote reports. They moved on to the next case. Survivors were often left in a limbo that compounded trauma. Some were doubted. Others were quietly encouraged to try to move forward. A few pushed, called for updates, demanded progress. They rarely got satisfying answers. Cold case units, as we now understand them, dedicated teams tasked with re-examining old crimes, were scarce. Funding priorities leaned toward active homicides, gang violence, narcotics. Sexual assaults that went unsolved quietly slid to the back shelves. Looking back, investigators now see clues they wish they had chased harder. The age range of the victims, the precision in timing, the military-adjacent geography in the early attacks, the controlled, methodical behavior that suggested training. But hindsight is cruelly clear. At the time, none of the individual detectives working those files could see the wider map. They were looking at trees, not the forest. The forest was spread across 3 states and a decade of police turnover. And so the kit sat. Names of detectives rotated off the case jackets. The survivors got older. The world moved on, but the DNA didn't. That it waited, patient, incorruptible, ready to speak when technology finally learned how to listen. When investigators finally named him in 2025, the question immediately arose. Who was Sean Patrick McNulty, and how had he evaded suspicion for so long? The answer lay partly in his chosen career, partly in the times he lived in, and partly in the persona he built. Disciplined, mobile, and outwardly unremarkable. Born in the early 1960s, McNulty came of age during a period of both Cold War tension and a surge in U.S. Navy recruitment. Like many young men of his generation, he gravitated toward the promise of stability, travel, and opportunity that military service offered. He enlisted in the Navy and specialized as a diver, an elite field requiring rigorous training. Navy divers are tasked with underwater salvage, ship repairs, demolition work, and occasionally classified operations. The physical demands are extreme. Divers must remain calm under pressure, navigate pitch-black waters, and solve technical problems while carrying heavy gear. That training produced discipline. It also produced traits that later echoed in his crimes. Patience, control, the ability to stalk and strike quietly, the confidence to disappear unseen. That McNulty's service took him across the country. Records place him on both coasts, often attached to bases near California before rotations inland. This constant movement mirrored the geographic spread of the assaults. Investigators now believe his postings may have provided both opportunity and cover. Opportunity because Navy personnel lived in and around civilian neighborhoods, close to young women, students, and working professionals. Cover because mobility made it easy to avoid long-term scrutiny. A predator in one city could vanish by reassignment to another base. By the time local detectives realized their leads had dried up, McNulty might already be in another state. Like many service members, McNulty alternated between stretches of active duty and periods of civilian work. During these transitions, he blended into communities where no one looked twice at a man who seemed disciplined, physically fit, and professional. Neighbors later described him as polite, quiet, sometimes distant. Nothing screamed danger. Nothing placed him under suspicion. Without a criminal record of note, he stayed off law enforcement's radar. Why he wasn't caught? Several factors kept McNulty invisible for decades. No criminal record. Jurisdictional divides. Military movement. Calculated methods. Era of silence. What haunted investigators most was the double image. McNulty, the Navy diver, professional and trained, versus McNulty, the predator, who turned that discipline into a weapon of control. Colleagues remembered a man who followed orders and excelled in his field. There were no reports of misconduct. To the outside world, he lived as many servicemen did, moving from assignment to assignment, making acquaintances, then leaving quietly when duty called. Inside the shadows, however, he hunted. And his ability to lead two lives, one visible, one hidden, was what allowed his crimes to remain unsolved for so long. By the time the assault stopped in the mid-1990s, McNulty was entering middle age. Perhaps he felt the risk had grown too high. Perhaps he believed he had outrun justice. For 30 years, he lived under that assumption. And for 30 years, 6 women lived with the memory of nights that had shattered their sense of safety. But DNA never forgets that if you visit any cold case storage facility in America, it feels like walking through suspended time. Rows of shelves, boxes with faded case numbers, manila folders stuffed with handwritten notes, Polaroids, and forms filled out by detectives who have long since retired. That's where the McNulty cases lived for nearly 30 years. The evidence wasn't lost. It was preserved. The DNA samples from the 6 rapes, collected carefully in the 1980s and early 90s, were properly sealed and stored. They had survived the transfer of cases between detectives, the reshuffling of police budgets, even moves between evidence facilities. They were, in the strictest sense, ready. What wasn't ready was the science that, in the late 80s, the first DNA-based convictions stunned juries. It was a revolutionary proof of identity. But those early tests required large, clean samples and took weeks or months to process. Labs could confirm that 2 biological samples came from the same person. For instance, that semen from one crime scene matched semen from another. But they couldn't name that person unless a suspect was already in custody and could be tested for comparison. For McNulty's victims, that meant police could, in theory, know that several attacks had the same perpetrator. But they had no face, no name, no address to go with the profile. It was like knowing the handwriting matched across multiple ransom notes, but having no idea whose hand wrote them. By the mid-1990s, the FBI's Cody's database came online. It let law enforcement upload genetic profiles and run them against other entries. A hit could link crimes across states or match a suspect to a crime scene. But Cody's depended entirely on who was in it. It was a closed universe. To trigger a match, the offender had to be arrested for and convicted of a qualifying crime, then swabbed for DNA. If they weren't convicted, or if their conviction wasn't in the right category, the system had nothing to search against. McNulty was never convicted of anything that required DNA submission. In the world of Cody's, he was a ghost. While technology improved, many states struggled with untested sexual assault kits. Labs were overwhelmed, budgets were thin, and political pressure to prioritize homicides meant rape cases too often waited years. In some jurisdictions, evidence went untested altogether. Others processed samples, entered them into Cody's, and sat back helplessly when the database came back empty. Detroit's backlog eventually revealed 11,000 untested kits. Los Angeles had thousands. Smaller cities had hundreds. Each untested kit wasn't just a case file. It was a story, a survivor, a trauma left unacknowledged by the justice system. The silence of the 90s and 2000s. For 2 decades, the McNulty cases sat frozen. Detectives rotated in and out of cold case assignments. Occasionally, someone pulled a file, reread the witness statements, check for updates. Then the file returned to its shelf. No new leads. No suspects. The paper grew older. The DNA did not. Survivors built lives. Some try not to think about it. Others carried anger like a splinter, not always visible, but never fully gone. They had been told the system would pursue justice. The system had simply run out of map. Meanwhile, in the background, a parallel story was taking shape. The rise of genetic genealogy. What started as hobbyists mapping family trees eventually became one of the most powerful investigative tools in modern policing. By 2018, the world saw what was possible with the arrest of the Golden State Killer. Detectives had uploaded crime scene DNA to a public genealogy database, found distant relatives, and built a family tree backward until they reached the suspect. It was part biology, part detective work, part data science. And it worked. Suddenly, decades-old crimes had a new path forward. Suddenly, cold cases like McNulty's were no longer frozen. IT didn't happen in a dramatic cinematic flash. It began, as most cold case breakthroughs now do, in a laboratory office with a long spreadsheet and a soft chime from an inbox. In early 2025, a detective working in California's statewide cold case unit submitted the combined DNA profile from one of the 1980s sexual assault kits to a private lab specializing in forensic genealogy. These labs didn't just test DNA. They translated it into a language that genealogy databases could understand, a set of markers that could be compared against profiles voluntarily uploaded by people curious about their ancestry. When the report came back, it wasn't a direct hit. It never is. Instead, it was a list of names, people who shared small but significant stretches of DNA with the unknown suspect. Not siblings, not parents, more like third cousins, maybe fourth. Distant relatives whose shared segments of genetic code pointed toward a branch of a family tree. Cold case genealogy is equal parts science and meticulous, almost old-fashioned detective work. A small team of analysts, often retired detectives with a passion for puzzles, begins charting. They start with the closest genetic matches, build backward through birth, marriage, and death records, then forward through descendants. They account for siblings, aunts, uncles, multiple marriages, adoptions, and name changes. Each new line either expands the tree or prunes it closer to the right individual. In this case, the branch is stretched across several Midwestern and East Coast states. But one name kept recurring in proximity to key time frames and places: Sean Patrick McNulty. The profile emerges. The deeper the analyst dug, the more the picture clarified. Age fit. Born in the early 60s, McNulty would have been mid-20s to mid-30s during the assaults, consistent with victim descriptions. Geography fit. His military postings put him in California, then later in Michigan and Ohio, within months of the crimes. Occupation fit. Navy diver. Highly trained, physically capable, disciplined, and accustomed to moving undetected through both structured and unpredictable environments. Criminal history. None on paper. A clean record, which explained why Cody's never pinged on him. The probability math, the backbone of genealogical triangulation, narrowed the field until by late spring of 2025, only one person sat in the center of the target. Identifying a likely suspect is thrilling, but it's not enough. Investigators needed confirmatory DNA, a direct, legal, admissible comparison between McNulty's DNA and the crime scene profiles. That meant surveillance. Detectives began watching McNulty, who by then was retired and living quietly in a small Midwestern town. They trailed him discreetly, waiting for what investigators call a discarded DNA opportunity, a coffee cup tossed in a public trash can, a cigarette but a water bottle left behind. Within weeks, they had it. A styrofoam coffee cup, retrieved legally from public waste, swabbed, packaged, sent to the lab. When the call came, it carried no hesitation. It's him. All 6 kits. Same contributor. Match confirmed. For the cold case team, the confirmation was both exhilarating and sobering. They had cracked a case that had eluded justice for over 3 decades. But on the other end of that victory were 6 women, now in their 50s and 60s, whose lives had been forever shaped by a man who had walked free all this time. Before the arrest could happen, victim advocates reached out to each survivor. Some wept. Some sat in stunned silence. One reportedly whispered, "I stopped believing this day would ever come." For the first time in years, the case files came down from their shelves not to be stored, but to be closed. The arrest itself was deliberately quiet. By summer 2025, after months of genealogical mapping, surveillance, and a watertight lab confirmation, the cold case task force had a warrant. They coordinated with local police in the small Midwestern town where McNulty had settled after leaving the Navy. The operation was scheduled for a weekday morning, calculated to minimize public risk and maximize control. At the T6:10 a.m., 3 unmarked cars rolled onto the cul-de-sac. 2 plainclothes detectives approached the front door while uniformed officers secured the perimeter. The knock was firm, not frantic. When McNulty answered, still in a t-shirt and sweatpants, they read him his rights calmly but clearly. He didn't resist. According to arresting officers, he looked confused, even detached, like a man woken into a reality he hadn't prepared for. His only words were, "What is this about?" McNulty was transported without incident to the county jail. Fingerprints, mugshots, property inventory, paperwork that looked like every other booking sheet. Except the charges weren't routine .6 counts of aggravated sexual assault, spread across 3 states, each backed by a DNA match and a paper trail stretching back more than 30 years. Federal jurisdiction loomed as a possibility because the crimes crossed state lines. Detectives didn't rush. They let the gravity settle, then scheduled the first interview in a neutral, quiet room at the sheriff's office. 2 veteran cold case investigators sat across from McNulty, a digital recorder on the table, a legal pad between them. The opening was standard. "Sean, you know why you're here?" He shook his head. Eyes steady, not defiant. More like someone bracing for impact. "We have DNA evidence linking you to a series of sexual assaults in California, Michigan, and Ohio in the late 80s and early 90s. It's conclusive." Silence. Then a long, audible breath. Initially, McNulty denied everything. He questioned the science, suggested contamination, floated the idea of mistaken identity. The detectives were prepared for this. They walked him through each case, dates, places, victim accounts, the indisputable genetic link. "These aren't coincidences," one detective said. "They're you." The denials weakened. His answers shifted from no to "I don't remember" to "that was a long time ago," a subtle but telling pivot from rejection to avoidance. Legally, they didn't need a confession. The DNA was overwhelming, the genealogical trail airtight, the corroborating details devastating. But they gave him the chance to speak, for himself, for the record, perhaps even for the survivors. That McNulty eventually spoke in halting fragments. "I was young. I drank. Things got out of hand. I never meant to hurt anyone like that. It's a different world now." They pressed him on control, on planning, on the chilling precision of the attacks. He wouldn't engage. He lowered his head, closed his eyes, and said nothing else. Within days, prosecutors from each state began coordinating. The question wasn't whether to charge him. It was how. Extradition agreements, statute of limitations research, victim preference, and judicial strategy all came into play. Some jurisdictions had reformed their laws in ways that allowed old cases to proceed. Others relied on creative legal theories and recent precedent. By late July 2025, McNulty faced a mosaic of indictments that, taken together, carried the possibility of life in prison. For the first time in decades, the survivors saw the system moving not in slow, frustrating circles, but in a straight, deliberate line toward accountability. Even with the genealogy breakthrough, nothing in a courtroom is automatic. Prosecutors had a stack of facts. Defense attorneys had a constitutional mandate to challenge every one of them. Before a single juror was sworn in, months of legal maneuvering shaped the battlefield. But McNulty's crimes had taken place in 3 states, each with its own laws, evidentiary rules, and statutes of limitation. In the late 1980s, some jurisdictions had strict time bars on sexual assault prosecutions. Over the years, many legislatures rewrote those statutes, recognizing that rape cases often stalled not because of weak evidence, but because of systemic failure. The central legal question became, could a crime committed in 1988 still be tried in 2025? In California, yes. A 2017 reform abolished the statute of limitations for certain felony sex crimes, retroactively preserving cases where DNA had identified a perpetrator. In Michigan and Ohio, the answers were more complicated. Courts wrestled with ex post facto arguments, balancing the rights of defendants against the state's interest in prosecuting violent felonies once a suspect was finally known. Prosecutors leaned heavily on a common doctrine, the discovery rule, arguing that the clock on the statute of limitations should start when a suspect is identified, not when the crime occurred. Particularly in DNA-driven cold cases. McNulty's legal team, a pair of experienced defense attorneys appointed after he invoked his right to counsel, went after the investigation itself. They questioned chain of custody, genealogy, memory degradation. They also raised what they knew was the strongest emotional lever, time. Jurors, they argued, would be judging a man in his 60s for acts allegedly committed by a version of himself that no longer existed. The implication was subtle but strategic. Justice delayed might also mean justice distorted. The state answered with blunt precision. DNA doesn't forget. Survivor testimony. Genealogical investigation. For 6 women, the trial wasn't just a legal proceeding, it was the exhumation of the worst nights of their lives. Some had to face McNulty in the courtroom. The man who had terrorized them in their youth now sat gray-haired, in a suit, at the defense table. Testimony days were quiet, tense. Jurors leaned forward, taking in stories told with careful pacing, sometimes through tears, sometimes with icy composure. Each account reinforced the pattern. Controlled entry, verbal threats, physical restraint, no robbery,
Subscribe, like, comment, and follow up for our next videos.
precise exit. The state built a picture of a man who stalked, planned, and executed assaults with military-grade discipline. The legal wrangling attracted media coverage, partly because of the Navy connection, partly because of the genealogical angle. National outlets framed it as another signpost in the age of DNA reckoning. A wave of justice sweeping through crimes once thought untouchable by time. The McNulty's lawyers filed motions to suppress the genealogical evidence, to sever the cases by state, to delay trials citing the complexity of multi-jurisdictional logistics. All were heard. Most were denied. Prosecutors chose to try the California cases first. The evidence was strongest there. The law was most favorable. Opening statements were simple. This case is about truth meeting time. It took decades for science to speak loudly enough, but now the evidence has a name. The defense tried to humanize McNulty, portraying him as a man who had served honorably, lived quietly for decades, caused no further harm. They didn't argue mistaken identity. The DNA closed that door. They argued context, intent, fairness, but the jury's task wasn't philosophical. It was factual. After 4 weeks of testimony and 2 days of deliberation, the verdict came guilty on all counts. The courtroom was silent except for the quiet sobs of a survivor in the front row. That first conviction cleared the path for Michigan and Ohio to move forward. Even if appellate
McNulty was already a convicted serial
rapist, facing life sentences. Plea negotiations began, not for mercy, but for efficiency. The survivors were offered the chance to avoid more testimony if McNulty entered guilty pleas in the remaining cases. Most agreed. The priority was accountability, not repeated trauma. WY fall of 2025, he had pleaded guilty to additional counts in exchange for concurrent sentences, ensuring he would never leave prison alive. Sentencing hearings in cold cases feel different. They are quieter than trials, less theatrical, more human. The law has done its work. Now, everyone in the room faces the raw consequences of what happened. Not in evidence exhibits, but in lives. The California courts scheduled McNulty's sentencing for late October 2025. Because of the plea agreements that followed his conviction, all jurisdictions agreed to have one consolidated hearing, with victims and their families flown in or linked by secure video. The judge, a veteran of both criminal and family courts, opened with something that sounded more pastoral than procedural. This case is a reminder of two things. First, that time does not heal wounds. People do. And second, that truth may take decades to surface, but when it does, the law must stand ready to act. One by one, 6 women stood, or in 2 cases appear by live feed, to deliver victim impact statements. Each was different in tone. All were devastating in weight. The first spoke of fear calcified in a habit, how she never slept without checking every lock twice, even 30 years later. The second spoke of anger. At him, at the system, at the universe that had let him live freely while she built her life around trauma. The third, voice trembling, said simply, "You stole something I never got back, but you don't get to have my future." A fourth thanked the detectives and lab techs by name. A fifth apologized to her own adult children for what she hadn't been able to explain. The 6 paused for a long time, then said, "I wanted to hate you. For a while I did. But hate is a kind of tether, and I'm cutting it now." When offered a chance to speak, McNulty stood. He didn't look defiant. He didn't look broken. He looked like someone trying to read a script he hadn't prepared. "I can't undo what happened. I don't expect forgiveness. I don't even ask for it. I know I ruined lives. I was a coward then. I'm a coward now. That's all I have to say." He sat down. No one in the courtroom moved. The judge read from a pre-written decision, but the tone was heavy with deliberate gravity. For each of these crimes, the law prescribes a maximum penalty. It is the judgment of this court that these sentences shall run consecutively. The cumulative effect is that you will spend the remainder of your natural life in the custody of the Department of Corrections. You will not be eligible for parole. You will never again be free to harm another human being. Gavel. A sound like a door shutting, not just on a case, but on an era of unanswered questions. Outside, the press waited. Some survivors chose to speak. One, flanked by her adult daughter, said, "This isn't victory. There are no wins here, but it's an ending, and sometimes that's enough." Another, quieter, simply said, "I slept through the night last night. First time in years." The McNulty case quickly became a touchstone in law schools and police academies, a case study in perseverance, technology, and the human cost of delay. Advocacy groups used it to push for further backlog clearing programs, improve survivor support, and standardization of genetic genealogy protocols. For cold case units across the country, it served as both encouragement and caution. Encouragement that justice can survive time, caution that behind every dusty file is a person waiting for closure. The McNulty case doesn't close with a headline. It continues in subtler ways, in a way survivors breathe differently, in a way detectives stare a little longer at the boxes in their evidence rooms, in a way lawmakers talk about the future of forensic science. When a court emptied, 6 women went back to 6 very different lives. None of them became the person who was attacked. They were parents, professionals, neighbors, advocates, some loud, some quiet. The case had defined a part of their lives, but not the whole. What changed after sentencing was the invisible background hum, that ever-present knowledge that the man who hurt them was out there, living free, somewhere. That hum is gone. Some still attend therapy. Some don't. Some advocate publicly for rape kit testing and cold case funding. Others never want to see a microphone again. But every one of them now moves in a world where the loop is closed. There is no perfect justice, but there is accountability, and for many survivors, that's the difference between a wound and a scar. The case has already been dissected in conferences and memos. Genealogical forensics now has bipartisan legislative interest. Lawmakers are drafting clearer guardrails. When, how, and with what oversight police can use public databases. Statutes of limitation are being re-examined in states that still have restrictive clocks on sexual assault cases. The moral question is stark. Should a rapist walk free simply because technology wasn't ready yet? Evidence preservation standards are being strengthened. Old kits once seen as dead weight are now treated like latent gold. Silent witnesses waiting for science to catch up. Detectives in cold case units talk about the emotional economy of their work. Most of what they touch never moves. Leads stall. Budgets shrink. Public attention drifts. Cases like McNulty's are their counterweight. Proof that sometimes, after years of waiting, the lock finally clicks. One retired detective who worked the original California case, now in his 70s, attended the sentencing. When asked why, he said, "You spend a career chasing ghosts. Every now and then, one of them turns around. I just wanted to see it with my own eyes." True crime as entertainment can risk turning suffering into spectacle. The McNulty case offers a reminder that behind every forensic chart is a person. Behind every case closed stamp is a lifetime of waiting. The story resonates not because it's lurid, but because it's human. The endurance of grief, the stubbornness of truth, the long arc of accountability bending. Finally, toward the people who needed it. Some weeks after sentencing, a clerk boxed up the now complete case file. The box was heavier than it had been. Transcripts, warrants, verdict forms, victim impact statements, photos of evidence that had once been sealed on the outside. A new label was taped. Status, closed. Suspect, convicted. Sentence, life without parole. No celebration. No parade. Just a quiet act of bureaucratic closure that, for the first time in 30 years, matched the truth that in a world full of unsolved stories, that matters.
If you found this story as compelling as we did, don't forget to hit that like button. It really helps more people discover these cases. Subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our deep dives into true crime stories that matter. And I'd love to hear from you. Drop a comment below with your thoughts, theories, or the cases you'd like us to cover next. Your voice helps shape this community. Thank you for watching, and as always, stay safe.